At 6:30 in the morning, under the pale light of a new day, history was written not with armies nor with treaties, but with words. In the heart of Addis Ababa, before a sea of cameras and a gathering of presidents, ministers, and journalists, one man stood tall. His name was Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a leader scarcely known to the world a year before, but now a voice that could not be ignored. He did not whisper. He did not hedge. He spoke with the unshakable cadence of a prophet. Mr. Netanyahu, you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here. The hall froze. Time itself seemed to pause, and across continents, from Accra to Atlanta, from Johannesburg to Harlem, hearts quickened. Was this a fleeting defiance, or the dawn of a new chapter for Africa's dignity? Brothers and sisters, today we trace the echo of that declaration, not as spectators, but as witnesses to a story that belongs to us all. And before we begin, I invite you, yes, you, to subscribe, to join this fellowship of truth-tellers, to walk with us as we uncover what the world would rather keep hidden. It began not with a roar, but with a whisper carried through the back corridors of power. The world would come to know it as the Addis Ababa Ultimatum. Yet its roots stretched back to a closed-door gathering far from the African sun. In the hushed chambers of a G7 meeting, words were spoken, dismissive, cutting, contemptuous. According to those present, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu mocked Africa's leaders, reducing their struggles to theater, their critiques to childish naivety. He reportedly spoke of Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré as little more than an opportunist. The remarks were meant to stay sealed behind polished doors, yet as leaks have always done, they seeped through. Journalists caught the scent. Diplomats whispered in hallways, and within days, the insult spread like fire through the dry brush of African media. Hashtags multiplied. Outrage surged. Talk radio buzzed from Lagos to Lusaka. And still, through it all, the man at the center, President Traoré, remained silent. It was a silence that confounded many. Why would a young leader, famed for his fiery speeches and bold reforms, hold his tongue while his name was dragged through the mud? But hindsight is a stern teacher. That silence was not a weakness. It was preparation. While others fumed, Traoré was sharpening his moment, biding his time for the stage that would amplify his voice not just across Africa, but across the earth. The stage came on the 27th of August at the African Development Summit in Addis Ababa. The sun had barely risen when delegations filed into the Grand Hall. Cameras clicked. Translators adjusted their headsets. Heads of state murmured in corridors. Few suspected that before the morning was done, the world would tremble. At precisely 6:30, Captain Ibrahim Traoré took the podium. Dressed in his simple military fatigues, he did not carry the polished charm of a career diplomat. He carried something older, heavier, the weight of dignity long denied. He looked not at his notes, nor at the floor. He fixed his gaze upon the cameras, knowing his words would travel farther than the marble walls around him. And then he spoke. "Mr. Netanyahu," he declared, voice steady, unflinching, "you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." The hall froze. The fingers of journalists hovered above keyboards. Delegates leaned back in their chairs, caught between disbelief and awe. The silence was thick enough to taste, for this was no carefully scripted communiqué. This was no routine call for dialogue. This was a line drawn in stone. The speech was brief, but its brevity made it thunderous. Traoré invoked dignity, sovereignty, and history. He reminded the world that Africa was not a pawn in foreign games, not a stage for Western experiments, not a market for exploitation, but a continent with its own voice, its own destiny, its own unyielding pride. His words struck like hammer blows upon the anvil of international politics. Outside the hall, the reaction was immediate. Clips of the ultimatum flooded social media before the summit had even adjourned. News tickers flashed across televisions in Paris, New York, Johannesburg. Commentators struggled for words. Never in modern diplomacy had an African leader addressed a Western power with such directness, such audacity. Inside Burkina Faso, radios carried the voice of their president into villages, towns, and markets. Farmers paused in their fields. Merchants looked up from their stalls. Elders sat in silence as the words were replayed. Many whispered that they had not heard such defiance since the days of Thomas Sankara. For in Traoré's voice, they heard not just politics, but prophecy. The prophecy of a continent tired of bowing, tired of begging, ready at last to stand. And yet, as the crowd dispersed from the summit hall, as the headlines multiplied, as hashtags surged across X and TikTok, one truth lingered above all. This was only the beginning. A statement had been made, but the clock was now ticking. 48 hours. The world would not have to wait long to discover what those hours would unleash. But my friends, that morning in Addis Ababa was not the end of the story. It was the spark. The question now was not whether the ultimatum had been spoken, but how the world would answer its echo. The words had scarcely left the lips of Ibrahim Traoré before the tremors began. At first, it was the hush of disbelief inside the conference hall. But disbelief, like a pebble dropped into still water, spreads outward in waves. And before long, those waves became a storm. By the time the sun had climbed higher over Addis Ababa, the ultimatum had already reached every corner of the globe. News outlets rushed to replay the clip, analysts stumbled to find context, and millions on social media seized the moment. Within hours, the hashtag blazed across the digital landscape. Africa is not your porn. It leapt from Lagos to London, from Johannesburg to Washington, from Accra to Atlanta. Millions shared, millions debated, millions declared. For the people of Africa, long accustomed to seeing their leaders muted on the world stage, this was a revelation. Suddenly, they were not defending themselves against insult. They were watching one of their own turn insult into defiance, shame into dignity. In the streets of Ouagadougou, posters of Traoré were raised. In university halls of Nairobi, students erupted in debate. In the markets of Lagos, vendors replayed the video on their phones, shaking their heads in wonder. And everywhere, one phrase returned again and again. Finally, someone said it. From governments, too, the ripples spread. South Africa's foreign minister reposted the viral clip, adding a simple line, "At last, truth on the global stage." Kenya's former ambassador to the United Nations declared it the future of African diplomacy, fearless and incorruptible. These were not fringe voices. These were seasoned diplomats, men and women who had spent decades threading the tightrope of international politics, now standing to applaud a declaration that was anything but cautious. Israel's response, by contrast, was curiously muted. The Prime Minister's office released only a short statement denying the leaked remarks, refusing even to address Traoré's ultimatum directly. For many Africans, that silence spoke louder than any denial. Analysts noted what countless citizens had already felt for years, that African dignity was too often brushed aside, ignored, treated as a matter beneath reply. In trying to avoid escalation, Israel had unwittingly stoked the fire, and the fire spread. Across African media, the ultimatum dominated headlines. Commentators called it a diplomatic earthquake. Talk shows filled with callers praising Traoré as a modern-day Sankara, a leader not afraid to stare down the powerful. On X, TikTok, and Facebook, the clip was replayed millions of times, translated into dozens of languages. It became more than a moment. It became a rallying cry. In the diaspora, the response was equally electric. In London, in Paris, in Kingston, Jamaicans and Africans alike marched with placards bearing the words, "Respect Africa." In Harlem, the streets echoed with chants of "Africa stands tall, Africa stands proud," a chorus that connected generations of struggle from civil rights to decolonization. For many in the African American community, Traoré's voice sounded like the voice of ancestors long silenced. A bold refusal to bow, spoken not in whispers, but in thunder. Yet even as crowds cheered, even as hashtags soared, a darker undercurrent rippled beneath the jubilation. The ultimatum was a line in the sand, but what if it was ignored? What if the 48 hours passed with no apology, no recognition, no change? Could the fire of unity burn bright enough to withstand the cold winds of disappointment? In Addis Ababa, inside the offices of the African Union, that question weighed heavily. Diplomats began urgent discussions. Whispers circulated of joint measures, even sanctions, should Israel fail to respond. Leaders who had once hesitated now felt the weight of public expectation pressing upon their shoulders. Africa had spoken with one voice, but could it act with one will? Meanwhile, Western capitals watched with unease. In Paris, in Washington, in Berlin, officials scrambled to assess the fallout. Was this a passing tempest, or the birth of a storm system that would reshape the very map of global alliances? Could one man with one ultimatum really tilt the balance of international power? The countdown ticked on. The world held its breath, and all the while, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent. He had spoken once, and once was enough. The burden of response now lay not upon him, but upon the world. But my friends, the countdown was not only political, it was spiritual, it was symbolic. For as the clock ticked, the question deepened. Would this ultimatum spark lasting unity, or would it crumble under the weight of expectation? When the words of Ibrahim Traoré echoed across Africa, they did more than rattle foreign ministries. They stirred the very soul of a continent. In Burkina Faso itself, a nation battered by insurgency, poverty, and displacement, the ultimatum became a torch lifted high against the darkness. In Ouagadougou, citizens poured into public squares. They carried banners that read, "Africa stands with Captain Traoré" and "Respect Africa." In villages where conflict had displaced thousands, families huddled around radios, listening to the replay of his speech. Children repeated the words aloud as if memorizing scripture, "Africa will not be your pawn." Even in refugee camps, where despair had long been a daily companion, people found a flicker of pride in the young soldier president who dared to speak without fear. It was not only the poor and displaced who felt the surge of unity. Opposition politicians, once fierce critics of military rule, found themselves muted. For to criticize Traoré now risked being labeled unpatriotic, even traitorous. His popularity soared. Polls showed support for military governance rising from a modest minority to a clear majority. To many, Traoré was no longer merely a transitional leader. He was becoming the embodiment of national dignity. The comparison was inevitable. In newspapers and on social media, his name was whispered alongside that of Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkina Faso revolutionary who once declared, "We must dare to invent the future." For a new generation, Ibrahim Traoré was daring to reclaim it. His defiance reminded many of Sankara's bold calls for self-reliance, his resistance to debt dependency, his insistence that Africa must chart its own course. And in truth, Traoré had not only spoken boldly, he had acted boldly. In the months before the ultimatum, his government had moved to nationalize gold mines, to construct the country's first gold refinery, to distribute tractors to farmers. These were not symbolic gestures. They were attempts to wrest economic sovereignty back into African hands. To his supporters, the ultimatum was not a departure from these reforms, but their natural extension, the same spirit of independence now applied to the global stage. But the path of defiance is never smooth. With every cheer came a warning. Analysts noted that more than 7,000 Burkinabe had died in conflict since Traoré seized power, a staggering toll compared to years past. Human rights groups decried reports of forced conscriptions, arbitrary arrests, and silencing of dissent. Critics asked, could a government that demanded dignity abroad truly protect dignity at home? International voices added to the caution. Financial institutions whispered that such confrontational diplomacy might scare off investors. Western envoys requested quiet meetings, probing whether Burkina Faso would push its challenge beyond rhetoric into policy. There was a risk, they warned, that pride could invite punishment, sanctions, or isolation. Yet for millions of ordinary Africans, these warnings were drowned out by the music of dignity. The ultimatum had shown them something they had long been denied, a leader unafraid to confront power directly. And that vision was contagious. From Ghana to Senegal, from Tanzania to Namibia, citizens debated openly whether their own leaders would ever dare to speak so plainly. Some even called for a continent-wide reassessment of trade and diplomacy with Israel, insisting that no partnership was possible without respect. Beyond politics, the impact reached into the fibers of everyday life. In churches, pastors preached sermons weaving Traoré's words into messages of divine justice. In mosques, imams reminded worshippers that dignity is a gift from God, not to be surrendered to any nation. Around cooking fires, families told children of the ultimatum as if recounting folklore. Evidence that the long story of Africa's struggle for sovereignty had not ended, but lived on in their own time. Still, beneath the celebrations, a sober truth remained. Expectations had been raised to towering heights. If the ultimatum yielded no apology, no policy change, no lasting shift, what then? Would the fire of unity dim? Would disillusionment return with greater bitterness than before? The weight of that question pressed down on the African Union, on local leaders, on ordinary citizens. For 48 hours, Africa stood tall, but could it stand beyond those hours? Could this moment of unity become a movement, a doctrine, a permanent reshaping of Africa's place in the world? And so, my friends, as the countdown clock ticked toward zero, the hope was vast, the pride was fierce, but the stakes were perilous. Tell me, what do you believe? Did this ultimatum strengthen Burkina Faso's hand, or did it risk more than it could bear? Across the Atlantic, in the corridors of Washington, the ultimatum struck like an unexpected thunderclap. For decades, American officials had grown accustomed to African diplomacy wrapped in cautious language, couched in careful appeals for aid or partnership. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré's voice carried no plea. It was not a request, but a demand, a moral summons that left policymakers divided. In think tanks and newsrooms, the debates grew heated. Some analysts dismissed the ultimatum as reckless, a dangerous gamble that could isolate Burkina Faso and strain Africa's fragile ties with the West. They muttered that a small, conflict-ridden nation could ill afford to challenge a global power like Israel. Yet others, especially a rising generation of African-American scholars and activists, saw it in starkly different terms. To them, Traoré was not reckless. He was righteous. He was clarity in a world of diplomatic shadows, the embodiment of a continent declaring, "We will no longer be silent." On campuses from Howard University to UCLA, student forums sprang up almost overnight. Professors paused their lectures to discuss the ultimatum as history in the making. Young African Americans spoke of the resonance they felt hearing in real time an African president defy the hierarchies of global politics. The words echoed across Harlem, where the streets once filled with civil rights marches now reverberated with chants of solidarity. To many in the diaspora, this was not only Burkina Faso's moment, it was Africa's voice rising, and by extension, their own. Elsewhere, the reactions followed familiar patterns. Moscow and Beijing seized upon the ultimatum as a symbol of global South defiance, amplifying Traoré's message through state media. They painted him as a bold warrior against Western dominance, a leader of a new multipolar age. In Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, the response was more careful, even uneasy. European leaders avoided direct condemnation, instead calling vaguely for constructive dialogue. But between the lines, their caution betrayed concern. The old balance of influence in Africa was shifting, and they could feel the ground moving beneath their feet. In the Middle East, opinions diverged sharply. Some governments accused Traoré of needless provocation, a gesture that risked inflaming already fragile tensions, yet others quietly admired the audacity. For a young African leader, representing one of the world's poorest nations, to confront a seasoned Israeli prime minister, this was a spectacle of courage rarely witnessed on the global stage. Through it all, one truth grew unmistakable. Ibrahim Traoré had altered the conversation. He had not begged for recognition, nor had he sought permission. He had declared with prophetic cadence that Africa already possessed its place, its table, its dignity. The question now was not whether the world had heard, but how the world would respond. And so, brothers and sisters, as the countdown neared its end, the eyes of every capital turned toward one question. If this was the present, what path lay ahead for Africa's future? The 48 hours came and went. No apology arrived from Prime Minister Netanyahu, yet the absence of contrition did not diminish the weight of what had been spoken. Instead, it revealed a deeper truth. The power of the ultimatum was never in the reply. It was in the declaration itself. In Burkina Faso and across the continent, the ultimatum became more than a headline. It became a reference point, a compass pointing toward a possible future. For decades, African diplomacy had often been reactive, responding to crises, seeking approval, negotiating from weakness. But in those 2 days, something shifted. Africa had not asked for recognition. It had demanded respect. The path ahead, however, is neither smooth nor certain. The risks are real. Economic retaliation, diplomatic isolation, and the loss of foreign investment loom as potential costs. History reminds us that bold voices are often met with harsh consequences. Traoré himself faces the peril of rising violence at home, humanitarian crises, and the heavy burden of delivering on the reforms he has promised. A continent bruised by centuries of external interference knows well how swiftly hope can curdle into disillusion, and yet, hope remains. For if the ultimatum taught anything, it is that courage is contagious. What was once unthinkable has now been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it cannot be unsaid. Leaders in South Africa, Kenya, and beyond now find themselves pressed by their people to match the boldness of Burkina Faso. The African Union, long accused of timidity, has glimpsed the possibility of a stronger collective stance. Even in parliaments across Europe and Asia, the ultimatum sparked conversations about the cost of ignoring Africa's voice. The way forward may not be written in treaties or polished communiques. It may be written in the simple but unyielding principle that dignity is non-negotiable. Africa's future will not be handed down from Paris, Washington, or Beijing. It must be forged in the fields of Burkina Faso, in the classrooms of Nairobi, in the bustling streets of Lagos. A continent that has too often been spoken for is learning to speak for itself. And perhaps, my friends, that is the true legacy of the Ado Saba ultimatum. Not whether an apology was won, but whether a generation was awakened. For dignity once claimed can never be returned. But the story does not end with 48 hours, nor with one ultimatum. It continues in the choices we make, in the voices we raise, in the vision we embrace. The only question that remains is this: will Africa walk boldly into that future, or retreat into the silence of the past? And so, beloved, the story of the ultimatum stands as more than a headline. It is a parable of dignity, a testimony carved into the conscience of our time. For 48 hours, a young captain from Burkina Faso stood before the nations and spoke a word the world was not ready to hear. Africa does not beg. Africa does not bow. Africa claims its place with its own voice. Yes, there was anger at centuries of disrespect, at the callous words spoken in secret chambers. There was sorrow for the countless lives lost in conflict, for the burdens that still weigh upon Burkina Faso and her neighbors. But above all, there was hope. Hope that from this moment, Africa might rise not as a continent divided, but as a family united by one principle. Dignity cannot be negotiated. Already the reverberations continue. Search the headlines and you will still find Ibrahim Traoré news echoing across platforms, debated in parliaments, whispered in classrooms, celebrated in marketplaces. Even amidst the daily tide of Burkina Faso news, this ultimatum remains a singular beacon, reminding the world that leadership does not require wealth or armies. It requires courage. The vision set forth in Addis Ababa is not complete. It is not finished. It is a seed planted in the soil of Africa's future. Whether that seed flourishes depends not only on leaders, but on people, on you, on me, on us all. The question is not whether Africa can rise. The question is whether we will rise together, bearing one another's burdens, refusing once more to let the world define our worth. And so, I ask you, dear listener, what do you believe? Was this ultimatum the beginning of a new chapter, or merely a passing moment? Do you see in these events the dawn of Africa's dignity restored? If this story touched your spirit, then do not let it end here. Share it, speak it, stand upon it. And if you have not yet joined us, I invite you, yes you, to subscribe, to walk this journey with us, for Africa's story is not over, and together we shall bear witness to every word yet to come.